So I've been asked to speak about safety planning from a survivor perspective, and I wanted to open with a quote from Survivor Voices. This was Oaith's research with 149 survivors in the province of Ontario. And listen to the seriousness of our voices and experiences. Get answer from those who have lived through violence. So this research calls on services and policymakers to include survivors in their work. Since we finished this research project, which we kind of call Phase 1, we went on to Phase 2, and the Status of Women Canada has been funding us for what we call our Survivor Voices Inclusion Project. So we have 2 project staff, and they're traveling across the province to work in communities with shelters to create increased inclusion for survivors. And this really about increasing not just services, but also around policy. So out of that traveling, we had a number of survivors who said, we want to participate on a provincial committee. So we developed the Oaith Survivors Advisory Committee, and then we readjusted our constitution, and we have the co-chair sitting at the board of directors now, beginning to offer us strategic input to our organization. And we're presenting the Survivor Voices Inclusion Project at the Canadian Domestic Violence Conference 3. So we're excited about that. Listening to those with lived experience of violence is essential for effective safety planning, we believe. He, who some of you may know, is a Canadian lawyer and expert in violence against women, and she says, nothing can adequately explain why this incredibly difficult social phenomenon of violence against women and girls that occurs in epidemic proportion continues to exist. She suggests there's 3 primary reasons why we continue to see such extensive violence against women and girls. She says there's a lack of punishment in the criminal justice system. And she says misogyny is still part of society. And she says that gender differences are still part of our socialization. Further, she goes on to talk about solutions needing to be multi-level. She also kind of talks about a real paradigm shift that's required. So some of what we're doing here over the last couple of days and at other things, we're really talking about collaboration and shifting so that we can work together across sectors, but that's not always easy, is it? There's another, Holly Johnson, who some of you may know, works at Ottawa University, and she's done international as well as Canadian research, and she summarized 10 years of Canadian surveys. And she says that half of all Canadian women have experienced at least 1 episode of sexual or physical violence in their lifetime. That's not even including child sexual abuse or the increased numbers for Aboriginal women. So if we just look at the room here today, most of us are women, so 1 out of 2 of us will have experienced some kind of sexual or physical violence. And that, it just keeps reminding me that we're not speaking about others, those out there, we're speaking about ourselves as women. But you know, the lived experience of violence provides a particular expertise when women have traveled through the system. And it requires a shift, I think, in our perceptions on what is important and to include survivors as experts in their own safety planning and in service delivery and in policy development. So most of you probably know Oaith, the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses. Each province across Canada has something similar. We're a provincial coalition of first and second stage housing for abused women and their children. And we work with member agencies to educate and promote change in all areas that abused women and their children tell us they need for freedom from violence. There's 96 funded shelters in the province of Ontario. And then part of those, there's 25 Aboriginal. Some of those are provincial and some of those are federal. And then there's 9 Francophone shelters as well. We work from a gender-based analysis that recognizes violence against women as embedded in social, political, historical, and economic structures. And we also come from an anti-racist, anti-oppressive perspective and an intersectional analysis that locates that the social location of survivors is critical because it reveals the impact of violence in a different way. Because when we look at race, class, we've talked about some of that, the structures, poverty, disability, financial resources, those kinds of things that really makes a difference in terms of understanding the impact on the violence. So since I only got 2 slides, I squeezed 6 little slides on one. Society here in Canada, we mostly focus on violence in intimate relationships. But when we take the broader view, using a gender-based and intersectional analysis, it expands a woman's experience of what safety means to her, because it's not only about her partner, but also about the systems designed to help her and her children be safe. So for us, individual advocacy and safety planning are most effective and helpful if they're from a broad-based systemic advocacy. So, you know, when they said, we'll talk about safety planning, it's like, you know, our shelters across the province use different safety plans. We don't have a comprehensive standard because what works for one woman won't work for another. Many of you are already doing safety planning. So when I started doing research, I thought, well, I could name this. There's lots of great tools. The Peel Regional, Northwest Territories doing some really great work. Springtide Resources here in Toronto did safety planning for the trans community. That's available on their website, which is in my list of references. So I think we are all at a place where we can look at our own safety planning. I'm not going to list these are great, these aren't. I think we can find out our own. But there's many ways of doing risk reduction strategies and safety planning. And so it depends on where we are intersecting with women, I think, on what tools we employ. And to think we've got one standardized thing that's going to work for everyone is not really helpful. So De Casserdy, who some of you know, works at the Oshawa University. He's an author, a researcher. He says that research shows that close to 80% of women being assaulted do leave the relationship eventually. So there's the physical leaving, which we know often happens several times, right? And then there's the emotional leaving and the ending of the attachment that we've heard spoken about. And then there's dealing with the impact of the abuse and the cognitive and emotional understanding of what that's been like for her and her children to have been in the abuse. So where we are in terms of our intervention with her, it's so important for us to recognize that. If we're intervening with her on her continuum, we need to be asking ourselves that question. There's some research, Goodkind, Sullivan, and Bybee. They did some research recently that talks about that women resist violence and strategize constantly about their safety. So we already know that, but I think it's really good to have the research to back that up, as we know evidence informs our practice in an ideal world. So they go on to say that the threat of and the actual violence itself limits women's choices. This research project said 2 strategies helped women the most. One was reaching out to a domestic violence service, and the second one was staying at a shelter. 79% of women in this research said that staying at a shelter helped them the most. That's a high number. And we know from the recent release, I think Claire is going to talk about that from the research here, that shelters work in diversity, lots of collaboration, and they have a wide range of services available. And women who stay in shelters are more likely to create safety strategies and risk reduction plans that are effective for them. Survivors tell us that they experience anxiety and distress, which makes sense when they're engaging with systems that they feel are disrespectful or disbelieving. When we support a woman from the position of inclusiveness and as an ally, she experienced it as more helpful. It seems like common sense, but we don't always do that as individuals within the system. It's not always easy to put aside our own agenda and listen to what she is saying to us. Judith Herman articulates this issue quite succinctly in this quote. She says, "The wishes and needs of victims are often diametrically opposed to the requirement of legal proceedings. Victims need social acknowledgement and support, but the court requires them to endure a public challenge to their credibility." So when we think about that as wherever we are in the system, all of us, including shelters, need to have that awareness that we're a system and that sometimes our needs might trump, and we keep needing to shift that back so that we can invite the woman who is disclosing and talking to us about that. We need to let the survivors lead through their process so that our needs don't become the driving force of the interaction. And when we're allies and include women at the center and as experts in their own safety planning process and risk reduction process, we know we've heard it again and again, and we absolutely support broad collaborative involvement, right? How can we do skillful safety planning and risk reduction without that? But we also know that survivors tell us they're not always treated with the respect and dignity by individuals in that system. And we know that for some women it takes several years to go through the disclosure process and keep dealing over and over again with different system representatives. One survivor describes her frustration with the services. She says, "When you have such a hard time with services that are supposed to help you, it rips it all away and it's devastating inside, and that can make you go back or give up." that voice really echoed in my head, because that idea that we're going to go back because we don't treat them with respect is really important, to kind of hear the voices of what they're saying to us. So more effective safety planning works better by developing a more comprehensive safety net and having awareness of where her continuum and how your organization or your representatives are interacting with her on her continuum, and her social location and yours as you're interacting with her, keeping awareness, as we've heard, about cultural competency. So if we actually want to be helpful and decrease or possibly eliminate violence in her life, I believe we need to come from that place. So in conclusion, working from a gender-based and intersectional analysis of violence against women, like the United Nations does, and many of you do here, the shelters recognize that individual-based advocacy is critical, but it informs a broad-based systemic advocacy. And developing a safety planning and effective risk reduction plans from a survivor's perspective is one way we can support women who are experiencing violence in our society to begin to work for freedom to end violence. That's our ultimate goal, surely all of us here. So the responsibility for ending violence against women in our society, whether it's at Christie and Bloor, some of you from out of the province may not know that there was 16 sexual assaults over a period of 6 weeks, the summer up to Thanksgiving. And that was really that's a lot for that short period of time. Or there's an example of state violence related to poverty, where our community social startup benefits were cut in Ontario recently by 50% and uploaded to the municipalities. We're not sure that women leaving shelters or leaving violence are going to have some additional funding. That's another example of state violence. And or a woman being assaulted by her partner. All of those things are relevant when dealing with a woman, and that requires a paradigm shift in our approach for all of us to take another level of responsibility to end the ongoing epidemic of violence against women and children. Thank you.